to get us started, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the genesis for the project and the inspiration behind the film.
Yeah, well, it kind of got very big quite quickly, this film. It's not like a typical first feature, and that's because this wasn't really a tactical move about moving into fiction. I was actually researching a documentary about violence against women, and I was trying to find a way into the story. I was working with NGOs in India, seeing some pretty horrific stuff on a daily basis. But I was finding that each time I kind of pointed my camera at it, it felt too frontal and graphic, and I couldn't find where the understanding was in all of that. So I kind of aborted the project quite frustrated. And then in 2012, we had this horrific case in Delhi of the young student on the bus, and all the world's media turned to India and this subject. And there was a lot of press, and there was one image, one photograph from that press, which I saw, which really struck me. And it was very angry, sort of full of hate, female protesters standing in front of a police lady. And this policewoman had such interesting and very enigmatic expression on her face, facing them, that I just thought, oh my God, that's who I tell the story of the violence through. She is them and she's not them. She has power and she doesn't have power. She's feared and she fears. So who is she? What's she thinking? And that was the genesis.
And then can you tell us about Shahana, the actress who plays Santosh? It's such a incredibly challenging role that she has to play, and she's in almost every scene. So how did you find her and know that she was right to be your Santosh?
Well, coming from documentary, I had a slightly naive idea that I was going to cast Santosh as a non-actor and have Sharma as a very experienced older actor. I knew that always. And then that natural dynamic would play out on set. I mean, thank God I didn't do that, because early on in casting, I really understood what it was to carry that on your shoulders and just the craft which was needed to make the day. Again, with a first-time filmmaker, like I relied on her a lot. She was just so professional. But instinctively, when I saw her, she was basically, the Santosha that I wrote was always a Santosha who was never just sort of a wide-eyed deer in the headlights. She was never that. She was always kind of hungry, kind of ambitious. Like the first time you hear about it, the in-laws, the mother-in-law's just saying, oh, but she only goes shopping, she's like this. And I kind of like that, because maybe it's true. I don't know, like maybe it's true. And there's also this idea, so I like the idea that there was someone who could, she has this physical presence in that uniform, which I find kind of iconic. I think she really wears that so beautifully. She has a lot of passion as well in her body, and I feel that like that is kept inside. This restraint of the grief that she holds after her husband's death. So this hard edge to her and this restraint with which I think this grief can lie underneath is amazing. And I think sometimes in, when you cast a non-actor, you often play on a blank face, like you have the events and then you've got this face, it's not doing that much. But I think seeing Shahana and her craft meant that she does play it. So her close-ups, she is playing it. She's playing it very restrained and very lightly, but she's playing it.
And then one moment that I really loved in the film, kind of playing off that, is when they're talking about performance, that everyone's playing a role. So how did you kind of incorporate that notion into working with the actors or the script?
Well, this came from my research with the police, where, we talk a lot about Bollywood, and the police all have their favorite Bollywood heroes, police heroes. Some of them joined the police because of some particular favorite Bollywood police hero. So there's this. And then in some of the scenes that I witnessed of bribery, of corruption, there was a huge amount of theatricality involved in those scenes about who's looking at who's exerting pressure on whom. Everything just did feel very, very theatrical. And I felt this intertwining with Bollywood and policing as well. So I wanted to give that a little bit of space to say, well, explore those themes.
And speaking of Bollywood, I was wondering, the police procedural is such a rich genre. I was wondering if there were any kind of films that you look to, either Bollywood or Hollywood, where we are now, that kind of inspired how you wanted to approach a police story.
I mean, just to say, first of all, I was so overwhelmed by the fact that this documentary idea then ended up in some police genre that it was just felt like I was biting off way more than I could chew for a first film. So I was kind of a bit intimidated by that. For me, coming from documentary, what's important is for me to anchor myself in something real, specifically if I'm working in genre for a first film. So for me, it was all about access to the police, spending time with the police and grounding in that. But in terms of tone, you know, there is a 70s era of American cinema, which really was a big, you know, inspiration in terms of the feel, the sort of grime and the dirt and the immersive quality of just feeling the place then and there. So, I mean, if I could have shot it on 16, I would have, let's put it that way.
Are there any questions in the audience? We'd love to hear. Yes, right here. The question, just to repeat so everyone could hear, was about the role of skin color in the caste system.
I mean, there's two references to that actually in the film. The first thing, though, just to comment on that particular transition between those scenes, was that for me, the joy of cinema is the economy of it, and what you can do in a cut. And for me, cutting from that dead girl, Dalit girl's like ripped open ear on the autopsy table to this sort of gyrating, lighter skinned woman on the TV, and the man consuming that sort of speaks to two things. One is about the value of life, of different bodies, and the other is about confusing messages about sex and how they play out in a society where it's also repressed, but then also consumed so potently. So that was one thing. Yeah, it was really about the value of the bodies. And the other mention to her skin color is when the little girl says, "Oh, I saw her here," and she's like, "Yeah, she's a beautiful young girl. Why would she die?" Yeah, but she was dark. And it's just for that girl, it's so natural to say that. It's just assumed that dark cannot be beautiful because that's what she's grown up with.
The question, just to repeat, sorry, real quick, was just about the juxtaposition when they found out maybe they got the wrong guy, but also there's a celebration going on at the same time.
So it's a really interesting question because this is the Holi festival, you know, the festival of color, which take place in spring. And interestingly, this whole film was not supposed to be in spring. After my research and watching Holi with the police, I changed the whole season of the script because I had basically been with the police in my research, seeing some pretty nasty stuff. And then I went to see them celebrate Holi, and the guys were all drunk, and they were just little boys, really. And they were kind of dancing quite feminine and singing their Bollywood songs and sort of gyrating. And there was something like very touching about that at one level. You know, these men who are quite violent sometimes in their work, but they just looked so childlike and also feminine when they were doing that. That was the starting point of why I changed the whole season. But then in that scene, when I wrote it into the script and we played it out on set, it was about the idea that, so in doing what she does, Shahana like steps over the line like many of those men already have. But for her as a woman, there's no actual release, you know? She can't actually join in with them to drink and dance and forget and have that whatever brotherhood around it. So it's the fact that she stepped over the line, but then she's so isolated in having stepped over the line as well. So yeah, both of those things.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the moral ambiguity of Santosh and how you kind of decided you didn't want her to use her as like a vehicle to see all the corruption and everything was wrong. How did you kind of conceptualize her and her journey through what was right and wrong?
Well, I just didn't find it very believable, you know, like the good apple in the bad system entirely. I mean, they do exist, but I'm just much more interested in this, you know, having a very morally murky universe and deciding, for me it was always, okay, what shade of grey is Santosh? And if she steps over the line of what she thinks she is, how does she bring herself back? I just think it's much more interesting and honest exploration. I also really like the idea, there's this idea that her husband, Raman, is a man of integrity. There's this line from the police when she gets a job. And I thought that was interesting because, again, I had this idea that Santosh was maybe always a bit more ambitious than her husband. Maybe she had it in her a bit more it was more suited to her, the police, than it was, even though she leaves at the end, that there was something a little bit more bendable about her than maybe there had been with her husband. And I like very much the idea that through the course of the film, she might reflect on who her husband was at work and what he did and, what he thought about everything.
The questions about the character of Sharma and perhaps the queer context there.
I mean, for me, I think that even if we'd asked Sharma, she wouldn't have a particular label on what's going on for her. And that's why it's in there with a very light touch. My motivation for this was just that I feel it's a very lonely place for Sharma to be who she is in the world that she's in. And there's two things, actually. There's a sort of loneliness and a need for intimacy, which I really imagine that she has. I don't even know what she wants to do if Santosh sleeps there with her, but I just think she needs to hold someone and be with somebody. And there's that part of it. And then also, we have an understanding of a sort of a homoerotic nature in art between men. And I didn't see why that couldn't exist between these two women at some level without it fully forming into something else. So there just needed to be a certain tension that's not necessarily, a strong homosexuality, but that is just an eroticism between women, which, exists.
And how did you work with the two of them to kind of create their chemistry?
I mean, we did a chemistry test, of course. We played many scenes silently. I watched them, together. And and at first Sunitha was like, "Oh, I don't think I can do this. No, I don't know." But then afterwards she was full of ideas and what she was going to do.
Great, thank you. I think, are there any more questions out there? Oh yes, right here. The question is, what's the distribution plan for Santosh in India and how you think the reaction will be?
I mean, we just had our premiere at Mumbai Film Festival. That went down well, but of course that's a certain type of press also, more favorable. We do have distribution, and now the first step, I think we're just about to approach a censor board. So even though the script, in India there's always a two-step process, as one to film as a foreign production, which we were part foreign, part Indian. So that script, the script got submitted as was. And at some point, the night before, my Indian producer gets super nervous, and he's like, "We can't even clean this script up because it's all over. Like it's in. We can't even just take out a scene. It's like deeply embedded. So let's just hope we pass it." So that was fine. We got through for the shooting. Now the second stage of censorship is the censor board. But again, what can they ask for in terms of cuts? It's going to be tricky. So I hope we manage. If not, I'll just fight like every other filmmaker does. I'll just fight it. Just gotta gather some stamina before that. But I appreciate your comments, because for me also it's all about this casual Islamophobia which is there. It's just sort of there, and even Raman's death, even her husband's death, it's not politicized for Santosh at the beginning. She's suffering, she's a widow, she's full of grief, but the amount of times things are drip fed into her, from Sharma, from the other cop when she has breakfast with him, that you sort of, by the time she hits the space where her husband was killed, she's already pretty psyched up, and that's how things are working in society there. So
the question was about the research process and if you embedded yourself in the police and how you did that.
Yeah, but this is totally off the record because I can't say that much like any journalist does about their access. But basically, the whole reason this film sort of took 10 years to make was that it took me a very long time to get access to the police. So at first I was working with police anthropologists on sort of early on in the process to make sure that early drafts of the script made sense and were based in something that I could believe in. But then I also knew that to direct, I needed to see some things myself. So I did spend quite a long time with them, and then also made sure that my actors spent time there too.
And you mentioned kind of how documentary informed, or didn't inform, I guess you took a departure from documentary to make this film. But I was wondering, once you got on the set, if you felt your background in documentary came into action, and how so, perhaps?
Yeah, I think I think I have a really good bullshit detector, which was my strongest sort of anchor in the film. It's just It's just every time the actors did something that didn't work, I just don't believe that. Do you believe that? I don't believe it. Don't believe it. Don't believe that. So that's sort of my anchor. Also about, you know, the pleasure I took from using non-actors who were based on location. That's something that felt a bit more integrated with every locality we were shooting in. And for me, it was a mixture of, you know, sometimes when fiction makers make documentary, it's a lot of shaky camera and things that we in documentary spend our whole life trying not to do, like shake the camera, like we're trying to hold it still the whole time. So for me, it was about, okay, the documentary aspect for me was about the credibility of performance, emotionally as well, of course, the credibility of those extra characters, the sets, shooting in live location, and layer and layer and layer of detail. It was all about detail, the cumulative effect of the details which came out of research. But at the same time, I wanted to use all the cinematic tools I could in a way that felt organic but precise.
The question was just about the nose piercings and the cultural and narrative significance in the film.
I mean, so the first mention is that her in-laws, when she goes and they berate her for wearing jewelry when her husband is dead, which includes her nose ring. That's the only moment in the beginning of the film we see that nose ring. Then it disappears. We don't see her take it out, but she's not wearing it when she joins the police. So after that, the nose ring is out. And then Sherma sort of brutally penetrates her with this nose pin in the van before she's about to go in front of the press with Salim. And I just lent into that because Sharma's saying, well, you can go out, you don't need to deal with this tradition. You have a nose piercing, you should wear the nose piercing and now go shine in front of the press. And then at the end of the film, for me, it's interesting because it sort of sums up her relationship to Sherma and what Sherma's given her, because although Sherma's manipulative and has done many disturbing things, Santosh has also grown an enormous amount under the watch of Sharma. Like, she has had an enormous growth and she has had a sense of power in herself. And for me, that little girl, you know, you see this so much in India, little street children with just like a little bit of neem stick stuck in their nose because they've got a piercing but they don't have a jewel. So there was something about her passing on that thing to that girl who's on her own, this sort of feminine power, for good or for bad, on the platform at night, which is very important for me to leave the film with that and not with Santosh, because that's sort of where I wanted the audience to stay. So it's something about passing that on. She doesn't need that anymore, or she's taken what she can from that, but that little girl sort of, I feel she needs a bit of Sharma to survive out there.